Hello! We found the most amazing creatures on this journey. And many of them. So, let's get into it. As you can tell by that sign, we're going to a place called Cedar Creek, which is about 45 minutes outside of Brisbane. It's near a town called Samford. It's right near the mountains. When you look out from the city, you can see the mountains. Right before those mountains is Cedar Creek. It's down this long, winding road. There's not many people around. There's lots of trees, and there's lots of farms. And as you can see, this one had some miniature horses. And then, right next to it, there was a bunch of goats, which I love goats. I find them very exciting animals to look at and listen to. And we're pulling up to the car park here of Cedar Creek. This can be very popular, but when we went there, thankfully it wasn't. There wasn't really anyone else. We ran into maybe 2 or 3 groups of people, and right down from the car park, we made an amazing discovery. Now, this is maybe a minute from where we parked, and we went and had a look in the river. There was a nice deep bit here, and there were some fish, but I couldn't capture these fish very well because they were very afraid of the camera, but I think that they were a kind of hardyhead, which is a native fish, and you can just see one going across that rock there, and then he disappears. But there was a school of them, and on the other side of that rock, there was an amazing creature. There was a freshwater eel. You can see his tail there, just slightly slithering between the rocks. He's got a really nice home here with lots of food and lots of room to swim around. And this eel looked really healthy. He had a really nice pattern on him. He looked like he'd been eating plenty of, presumably shrimp. There was a lot of shrimp in this creek. And you can see him dart off under his little crevice there. And all the shrimp go, they all freak out. And let's see, look at all those shrimp around him. And he's got a perfect little cave here where he can go and blend in. We only saw him just by chance. I was looking around, and then I saw this thing, and I thought, is that a stick? No, it was an eel. It was I think he's a short fin freshwater eel. They have an amazing life cycle. They're born in the ocean. Their parents can travel thousands of kilometers sometimes off into the deep ocean near New Caledonia. No one's sure exactly where, but we know it's near New Caledonia, and they go down there and they breed, and they sort of change a bit. They get a lot larger when they go into the ocean. They go through a lot of changes, and then they have their babies there, and no one's filmed it, so we're not entirely sure what happens then. And then their babies, they swim up into all the creeks, so all the creeks that you see where there's a freshwater eel, providing it's a longfin or a shortfin eel, they came from the ocean. And these shrimp, there was so many shrimp, there was millions of shrimp in this creek, but a few of them were white. And the reason for that whiteness, I'll explain later. It was not a good reason. But they all had interesting color patterns on them. As you can see, this one's kind of got a bluish tinge. Some of them had a reddish tinge, some of them were kind of see-through. Some of them had a little orange in there. There was a good variation in their colors. And it was very hard going up this creek. There was sort of a path at the beginning, but it quickly got into these big boulders that you had to really clamber over. It was very exhausting, and for the next 2 days, I couldn't walk properly. I was very, very exhausted from the strenuous journey. And every single pool we looked in was full of life. There was so many shrimp and little water insects swimming around. And I thought this was a really cool looking creek here. It'll be perfect for aquascaping. And you can see me climbing up this path here. There were sporadic paths throughout up until a point. And there's a swimming hole where people go swimming here, and it can be quite a popular swimming hole. We went well past the swimming hole. And we ran into a snake around here, and I didn't get the snake on footage, but just as I was jumping from bank to bank, on the rock I jumped onto, there was a snake just hanging out on the rock, and he was startled, so he darted off, and I jumped back, and I was quite startled as well. But I think he was just a tree snake trying to get some warmth, because we came here in the morning when the sun was out, and it was a good time for reptiles to be basking on the rocks. And this is the main swimming area. There's a waterfall, and there's a sign here which it used to say something like Cedar Creek swimming hole, but it's obviously been graffitied over. And this is where people go swimming. It's really popular, and I've seen people jump off the high rocks that I'm looking at in this frame, and they'd have jumped like 5 or 10 meters, which I wouldn't do. It seems quite dangerous. And this was above the swimming hole. We were just looking in the creek that was feeding into the waterfall. There was a lot of shrimp in here. Yeah, you see this great view going down to the swimming hole there. I was testing out a new camera for this, and unfortunately the camera had quite a bit of shake, and also it didn't pick up the colors very well because of the sun. I'll be going back to my old one in the next video. But see these shrimp? See that cool blue color? If you were to take these shrimp and breed them for generations, you would probably get a blue shrimp eventually. And they were all hanging out in this cool, hollowed-out log. I couldn't really get a good shot of it because, as I said, I was using this new camera, and it just didn't pick up very well. But they were hanging out in this hollow log. There was lots of shrimp in there. And a tadpole. We saw a large number of tadpoles, and these were frogs. They were some native kind of frog. They were quite large as well. They were a really large tadpole. It was really promising to see, and I thought this one, oh no, he's dead. But no, he's not. He swims away. He's actually doing very well. I guess there's lots of food for the frogs in here. There's clearly lots of food for the shrimp. The frogs were the tadpoles would eat little shrimp. They'd probably eat a bit of the algae there as well, and the little insects that you'll find in the creek. This is a really cool overhang area that unfortunately some people have, for whatever reason, decided to tag. But as you can see, it would be really beautiful without those awful tags. Do some art, like, it's not going to be better than the rock, but it would be better than a tag. And this is just up from that waterfall. Had a good look in the creek here, and it was like Shrimp City. There were so many shrimp living in this decaying sticks and leaves. A really healthy community of shrimp here. Just every single rock is covered in them. And the times I've been here in the past, there were never this many shrimp. So I don't know if it's the type of the time of year that we went there, or whether the population has just increased since the last time I went here a few years ago. And there's shrimp all through these little leaves and sticks. It's just so cool seeing this underwater. It's like the perfect aquascape. And then some people had drawn this in chalk years ago. It says Nude Creek with an arrow pointing up this way. I've never been up here, but there's not much of a creek up there. But this is the main creek. We didn't actually go up the Nude Creek. So having a look through, and there's a house, or a few houses, which, it might be some sort of nature eco-lodge. But it's fairly remote. It's quite hard to get to. There might be a dirt road on their property that gets there, but it's really far away from everyone else. And there's lovely moss that was growing on all the rocks. Oh, okay. This was very strange. When we saw this, we didn't know what to make of it. It was this long, weird worm thing. Very long as well. It was maybe 50 centimeters long. And we had a good look at it. And I found out it's called a horsehair worm. Unfortunately, it's a type of parasite that infects shrimp and grasshoppers and locusts and other sorts of creatures like that. And those white shrimp we saw earlier were unfortunately infected with this parasite. And we didn't know it was a parasite at the time, but I imagine this creek is infested with them, and their life cycle is they will, when they're a big worm like that, they'll live in the creek, and then eventually they'll release millions of tiny little eggs, which will turn into their larvae, and then find a host. And unfortunately, it'll be the shrimp or the grasshoppers or whatever creature is unfortunate enough to get infected by one, and they will live in that shrimp. And they won't go past the sort of abdomen, so the shrimp still has its legs and its head, but half of its body is taken up by this awful white parasite. I couldn't find any information if the shrimp die when the parasite leaves them, but typically for a parasite, their host doesn't die. I imagine it would be a very unpleasant experience for the poor little shrimps. And as I said, this creek there's plenty of white shrimp, so this parasite had taken over this creek. Yeah, it was creepy, and I looked it up when we got home, and thankfully it doesn't infect humans. So I'm very pleased to hear that. But a very weird creature, and they can grow to be 100 centimeters long. I'm not sure of what they do when they're in that worm life cycle, because they're not living off an organism then, they're just in the creek. Presumably, I don't know, eating algae or something? I couldn't find enough information on them. But they're apparently fairly common, and people used to think they came from horsehair. But they don't. They're a parasite that lives in the creek. And this was a pretty cool deep pool with a little tree growing in it. And underneath these rocks, this was quite deep. This was maybe 2 or 3 meters deep here. It was very clear, which was promising. And underneath those ledges there, you can't see very well, but there was another species of shrimp, which I got a little bit of footage later on. And you can see these shrimp, they were so curious, they were all swimming up to the camera every time I put it in the water. Now here, you can't see it very well, but there's the outline of something called a long-armed shrimp. And I haven't seen these in the wild before. I've only seen them in the fish shop. But I was so excited to see one, and unfortunately the camera didn't pick him up very well, but there was a good population in this particular area. There was 2, you can't really see them very well in this frame, but there was 2 adults having a little fight with each other. And they're really cool. They're much bigger than the little glass shrimp we saw. If you can see on the rock in the right-hand corner, there's one of the long-armed shrimp. But they're much bigger than the little shrimps, the little glass shrimps. The glass shrimps are maybe 3 or 4 centimeters, whereas these long-arm shrimp, they were much bigger. They were like 10 centimeters in their body, and then their arms were, another 10 centimeters. They were enormous. They were like a crayfish. Really cool to see them. I was not expecting to see them. But these little glass shrimp, they're fairly common, but there's a lot of different species of them, and there isn't that much information on the variation in species. So the species living in this creek could be unique to this system, because it's almost cut off from the rest of the creeks. It's only when it floods that they could get into other creeks. But here, I just saw this by chance. It's another eel, another freshwater short fin eel. And I thought he was a stick once again. But we had a better look, and he was sort of eyeing us off, thinking, what's going on here? I haven't seen this creature before. I don't imagine anyone has been in this part of the creek, because no one really swims past the main swimming hole. And this was a deep bit. This was a deep bit of the creek, and he was interested. This eel wanted to see what was going on, what this camera was doing in his environment. He was maybe 1.5 meters or maybe 2 meters underwater, and you can see the shrimp just going off like an explosion of life around him as he moves. And he got more and more curious of what I was doing, and he came up, as you can see, and had a good look at the camera. And eels, they can sense electricity really well, so I imagine he thought he could sense the electricity coming off the camera and thought, oh, maybe this is another creature, I should go and investigate. And he was very curious. He's got a sweet little face and such lovely little fins. And he looked healthy as well. I couldn't see any obvious signs of disease. But how on earth they got up here, I have no idea. Because this is quite far up the creek. This is really far from the ocean. This would be, you know, maybe 15 or... No, more than that. Maybe 30 kilometers from the sea. So he's gone a very long journey up to here, and somehow has gotten up that waterfall we saw earlier, which is... I have no idea how he did. It must have been flowing incredibly strongly for him to swim up it. Or maybe he went across the land a bit, but I'm amazed that we found him so far up. And shortfin eels are amazing. They can swim as fast backwards as they can forwards. They can go across land for 2 days, and as I said, they breed in the ocean. So they're an incredible species. I'm fortunate enough to have one as a pet. His name is Morag, and he's a little bit bigger than these ones. He's a bit chunkier, but they don't grow much bigger lengthwise, but they do get a lot more solid. This one's probably maybe a teenager, and look at his sweet little face. It looks like he's smiling. What a great creature. Hey! Hello. How you doing? Oh-wee! I'd love to get Morag a friend, but unfortunately, eels are not very friendly with tank mates. They have a tendency to kill things. He was very happy for me to film him. He loved being in front of the camera and loved coming up to investigate. I could have spent all day hanging out with this eel. We spent a good amount of time. We probably spent at least 40 minutes hanging out with him. I'm not game to put my fingers anywhere near them though, because they have quite powerful jaws, and they do this thing where they'll bite onto something and then spin. So you want to keep your fingers away from eels. There he goes, off to explore his section of the creek. Just such an amazing creature. And as for what he's eating, I presume the shrimp. There's plenty of shrimp for him to eat. I don't know their nutritional value. They seem to just be like a hard shell, but an eel could easily get through it. And then I guess he'd eat whatever, you know, frogs or insects land on the water as well. And here, we got to see this little green tree frog. I'm not sure the exact species, but we just saw him by chance, and there was a fly right in front of him getting a drink, which I think he was waiting out to try and go and eat. But I didn't even notice the fly at first. I just noticed this frog. And look at him. He's such a nice little frog. He's just hanging out on his leaf there. I hope he doesn't get eaten by the eel. But he was one of 2 frogs we saw, but I didn't get footage of the other one. And that was really promising, because I love seeing frogs. And these frogs, their life cycle is bound to the water. They have to keep moist all the time, and they have to lay their eggs in the water. And this was a really cool tree we saw, covered in those sort of succulent, I don't know what they're called, but they hung on to the branch all the way up this particular tree. We saw them on other trees as well. This tree was growing on a rock. You can see the sort of environment we had to traverse. It just got more and more extreme the further up the creek you go. This was an amazing spot here. I just had a beautiful waterfall. You couldn't hear or see any signs of civilization. You could hear lots of birds and the water flowing. And this was on top of that little waterfall. It had an awesome series of waterfalls going down. And Cedar Creek is fed by a mountain spring, so there's always water flowing through it. and it feeds many smaller rivers further downstream, all the way out to the ocean. And here is the biggest tadpole I've ever seen, guys. And he darted off just as I just got a glimpse of him. But he was enormous. I've never seen a tadpole that big. I wish I could identify which species he was. Maybe one of you knows, and you can leave it in the comments. But he was a really big tadpole, and he didn't have any legs yet, so I can't imagine how much bigger he was going to get. This was a particularly magical area. I loved walking along these rocks here and listening to the water. This is obviously a very ancient creek. It would be millions of years old. I'd love to know how old the species are that are living there. I presume the shrimp would also be an incredibly old species. And they are kind of unique because further down the river, I've found shrimp and they're almost always totally clear. And the ones up here, some of them have a blue tinge, some of them have an orange tinge. They all have little variations in color, which would suggest to me that, perhaps they're an isolated population and they have some differences to the others further downstream. And at this point, I knew we were getting close to the end, because at the end, there is a big waterfall, and not many people make it to the end. It's a very, very secluded location. There's no cell phone reception, and there's no one else around, so it's quite dangerous to be out there. If you go, definitely go with someone else. And you can just hear the waterfall off in the distance, purring away. And I got really excited because this was a long walk. It took almost an hour to get to this point of continuous clambering over these rocks. There's so much life and so many birds. And lots of tadpoles. We saw lots and lots of tadpoles. And there was lots of instances where we really had to climb. It wasn't all just walking along a riverbed. There was lots of big boulders and almost cliffs that you had to climb up. It's quite an arduous journey. Definitely take water and a hat and food. It's exhausting. We took many breaks along the way to have a look at what was in the creek. I'm quite tired at this point, but this is, if you do this journey, this is the magical part, because when you get to this is the end bit right here. I'm going to show you in a sec. There's a few pools. There's one really deep pool, and then there's a shallower pool above that, and then there's a deep pool which the waterfall flows into. And you can see here, it doesn't come off well enough on camera because this is an awful camera, and you can see that pool there, it's a very deep pool. And it was full of shrimp, like all the other pools. But it was too dark by the time we got there, because we'd spent most of the day hanging out, looking at cool frogs, and, hanging out with the eel and looking at all the shrimp. So by the time we got here, it was getting later in the afternoon, and it was very dark in the pool, so we couldn't really see into it. But it's maybe 3 meters deep in some parts. I think you can really see the awe and excitement in my expressions of what I'm looking at. And it's the final waterfall. And this final waterfall, there is a way to get up to the top of it, but I've never been to the top. I would really like to go up there one day, but you'd need to be an experienced rock climber to get up there. And I'm not an experienced rock climber. That'll be an adventure for one day in the future, though. I do hope to go up there eventually. And I want to follow this right to its source. And look at this. This is the big waterfall at the very end. It's incredibly tall. Maybe 10 or 15 meters tall. And there's that deep pool I was talking about. Got these lovely ferns and foresty plants all around it. It's a really great spot to hang out. We spent maybe a half an hour to an hour just hanging out here, listening to the birds and the river and looking at the shrimps. And as you can see, my friend there, he's next to this waterfall, and he goes up a bit further so you can get a sense of scale. Off to the right, where I'm looking at now, that's the only way up. It's very hard to get up there. It's boulders that I imagine would slip from underneath you very easily, or there's this rock face which there's lots of overhanging ledges, so that will be very hard to get up. And where the waterfall flows into, it's very deep there. It's probably 5 meters deep there. It's probably the deepest spot. But as you can see, my friend, he looks tiny compared to this waterfall. And now I had a good look in here and had a look at all the shrimps. I didn't see any frogs or any eels, but there were loads of shrimp. I'm just taking in the scenery right now. You can see the exhaustion, but also excitement on my face. It's just an awe-inspiring area. It's really magical. It's such a shame that some people have decided to tag on some of the stones. And in these shots here, it's quite hard to tell, but every single little... Yeah, look at all those shrimp just explode off like a party popper going off, like an explosion of life. But yeah, there's lots of this algae grass here, and in the algae grass, every little dot that you can see is a shrimp. So bear that in mind when you're looking at this. Yeah, see, every little dot here was a shrimp. There were so many shrimp. All around the same size as well. I didn't see many baby ones, but I think the breeding season is sort of... it will be happening in a week or so. So there will be lots of baby ones. And every single dot, look at all those dots on the grass, this mossy grass. Every single one of them is one of these glass shrimp. It's just so many. It's wonderful to see. You never see this many shrimp in creeks because, for whatever reason, usually something humans have done that all the shrimp have disappeared. But this is one of the few creeks where there's millions of shrimp in here. And up this far, I didn't see anywhere near as many white ones, so perhaps the parasite isn't as prevalent up this far. There's a pregnant shrimp. And lots of snails! These little cone-shaped snails were very interesting to see as well. I wonder if they're a native species. It's very hard to tell with snails because a lot of them look very similar. And this was the deep bit I just got to look in, but it was quite dark by this point, so you can't really tell the depth here, but it's deep. It's about 5 meters deep. It's kind of scary when you see it. You know, you don't know what could be lurking around in there. There's one final shot of the waterfall before we make our journey back. Our hour-long trek over these boulders and cliff faces to get back. And I had a look in this deep pool. But once again, it was very hard to see. It was kind of murky in this pool. Probably from the waterfall flowing. These lovely big ferns. They've been there for quite a while, because I remember seeing them 5 years ago. And they were smaller. So it's really good to see that they're still alive. I'm just having one final rest before we go for the trek back. What an amazing journey. There's lots of very smooth rocks, so you need shoes with a very good grip. My shoes did not have a good grip, so that's why I am sliding down it. Happening at Cedar Creek in terms of birds and frogs and snakes and eels and little hardy head fish at the beginning. Although this time was definitely the most species I've ever seen, but I think that's because we took so much more time to have a look at what was in every section of the creek. We really had a good look in every pool. And there were a few times where I was ready to keep going, but my friend, thankfully, he was laying down having a good look in the water, and so we stopped and we discovered all these cool things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. So I'd recommend you taking a good amount of time to just have a look in every single pool. Really, take a good 10 minutes at least to have a look in every pool, and you don't know what you'll find. There's also these amazing creatures. You can see those sticks there. They were sticks, but they had some little worm living in these sticks, and the worm would pull the stick around like a hermit crab. That little stick was like its home, and there was loads of those as well. Oh, and there's a long-armed shrimp. You can just see his feelers. There was a few under that ledge there, but I couldn't capture them. I imagine under most of these ledges there would be long-armed shrimp. They seem to like a dark area, a dark ledge, sort of a bit deep in the creek. And they eat algae as well, although they're scavengers, so they will eat other things, but I think the majority of their diet is algae. And there's a big tadpole as well next to these little shrimp. It really dwarfs the shrimp. I'd love to know what species these tadpoles were, because they were enormous tadpoles. There weren't many in the main creek, but there were lots in little pools left over from when the creek was flowing, after it had been raining, flowing a bit stronger. And it's such a shame that the colours are all blown out there, because you can't get a sense of quite how beautiful those rocks were, but there were incredible shades of blue and grey and sort of a stone colour. There was a tree that had fallen down, and it had fully fallen into the creek. It was blocking a section of the creek, but the water had found a way to push around it. Lovely clear. It's just like the perfect aquascape every time I had a look underwater. It's really inspired me to make my tanks look better. Yeah, it's a really nice rainforesty jungle up here. It's a very different landscape to the surrounding areas, which are mostly just gum trees and invasive species, but here, although there was plenty of lantana, which is an invasive species and takes over large amounts of land, but There was loads of native ferns and native trees. This camera did have an anti-shake feature, and it is on, so all that shaking is an anti-shake feature that doesn't work very well. And this is us heading back, just having one final look at that magical journey from earlier. Lovely little waterfall there. I wish this was my garden. I wish my garden looked like Cedar Creek. One of the most beautiful places you can go to, and is close to Brisbane. It's probably the closest of like an amazing nature walk that you can go on. But as I said, if you do plan to go here, make sure you go with someone else, because it can be very dangerous. There's a lot of snakes, and it is very remote. Lots of cool fallen trees that make awesome little bridges for you to climb across or go under. Them, so that's how they remain, but there's no like official paths. What an amazing place. We're reaching the end. There's unfortunately some more graffiti on a rock. Obviously, the rock looks better than that. It's a shame that people do that. Let's have one final look around, and then go back to the car and spend the next 2 days recovering. I hope you enjoyed in discovering all these cool species and having a good look at Cedar Creek. Thanks very much.